Hey there, my name's Lotlock, and this is a critique and opinion on the Phantom Pain. I've not done anything like this before, and it's a bit more negative than I had intended, but I don't think I fucked it up too much. Hopefully you'll enjoy it. The Phantom Pain's given me some mixed feelings. I really enjoyed the game, save for a few small segments. I had a lot of fun actually playing. If all I used to judge it was the gameplay, I'd probably think it deserved all the 10 out of 10 reviews it's gotten. Unfortunately, it's not. Unfortunately, despite being so much fun, I found myself really disappointed with the story. I'm not sure if reviewers didn't finish the game, if they don't care about the story, or if they just don't share any of my opinions, but none of the major reviews seem to be talking about the problems with the story. If they do mention them, they underplay them, simply saying it's scarce, but never saying that it's flawed. They all seem to focus more on the exquisite gameplay rather than the lackluster story. I don't really make reviews, but I wanted to talk about some of the stuff those guys are missing. I'll talk shortly about the gameplay before I get into the story, since that won't require any spoilers. As for the story, most of my criticisms are about how the story and characters were handled. The game may have some plot holes, but there are more knowledgeable Metal Gear fans who are sure to pick those apart. This was all written assuming you've been following the game's release. I don't want to waste your time going into too much detail about stuff you probably already know. With that in mind, there actually isn't too much I can say about the gameplay that reviews or trailers don't cover. If you've seen the game at all, you'll get everything you expect and more. You're loaded down with so many gameplay options that people will be finding new and interesting ways to complete missions years down the line. The guns, movement, CQC, and vehicles all have the polish you'd expect from a title this big. The game feels great. In the way of praise, I don't have much to say about the gameplay that other people haven't already. It's pretty brilliant. The biggest problem with the gameplay is that despite all these options, you may not find yourself using too many of them, at least not early on. Many of the weapons you unlock won't be silenced, meaning they're fairly useless if you plan on being stealthy. Your trank gun is monstrously powerful, and invaluable for expanding Mother Base. You'll probably use it until the end of the game, only switching away from it out of boredom, rather than having found a better option.
Guard post captured.
At least it's fun to use. Still, the options are there, and there are a lot of them. It's a shame they aren't more encouraged, but MGS has always been about the stealth, so I guess it's not too surprising. Now, as for the story, where to begin? There were a lot of trailers alluding to the plot of the game. If you saw them, then you probably thought Metal Gear Solid 5 was the story of Big Boss becoming the villain he is in later games, chronologically speaking. Many of these trailers implied that, for unknown reasons, Big Boss would have to become allies with his enemy, Skullface, and that this would lead him down a slippery slope. None of this happens. In fact, barely anything happens. So much is wrong with this game's story that I can barely believe Kojima wrote it. Not because I think he's infallible and capable of writing a poor story, but because these mistakes run opposite to everything that MGS games have done in the past. The story here is scarce. The game lacks a tenth of the cutscenes you'd expect from a Kojima game, and what few there are lack meaningful character interaction or development, and were cut up and put into trailers. Nearly every major scene in this game is featured in trailers. This is so unlike Kojima that I can't even understand how it happened. We're talking about the guy who avoided spoilers so well that people didn't even know who the actual protagonist in Metal Gear Solid 2 was until release. Suddenly he's throwing some of his best scenes and best dialogue into trailers. Why?
We're not burying them at sea. What then?
We'll make diamonds from their ashes. Take them into battle with us.
A shining light to our brothers in arms. Even in death.
We are diamond dogs.
These are some of the best lines in one of the best scenes in the entire game, and we've been seeing it repeated for more than a year now. The beginning of the final real boss fight? It's in the trailers. The final conversation with Skullface? Half of it's in the trailers. Snippets of the end of Quiet's story arc, the final scene with Big Boss, Paz, these things are all in the trailers. And there's more that I won't mention, just in case you didn't realize what exactly they were. You've already seen the best scenes in this game, and you've been seeing them for a while. I could forgive all this. If the story were good enough, I could get over having so many bits of it shown in the trailers. But I'm not sure it is. I strongly believe that the basis for a good story is good characters. Likeable or interesting characters with some development and depth. Characters are what draw us into stories and allow us to get invested in what we're seeing. All the nanomachines and Metal Gears wouldn't be worth a damn if we didn't like Snake. Kojima's been good about this in the past. He's given all of his characters ample time to speak, to converse with other characters, and to give the player some impression of their own character. Say what you will about 5 to 10 minute codec calls, but Kojima was making likable characters who actually had some texture, back when the biggest characters in gaming were still just mascots. And his characters are damn memorable because of it. Unfortunately, this is another instance of the Phantom Pain just not feeling like a Kojima game. The cutscenes here seem like they want to be gone as soon as they show up, and the only time they last any decent length is when they're focused on action or exposition, not the characters. Some scenes in previous MGS games may have been long, but at least the characters converse. Big Boss, or Venom Snake, is probably the worst offender in this regard. I feel I would have liked Venom a lot more if Kojima had stuck to his usual style. Don't get me wrong, that style isn't perfect, but I think Venom's role in this game could have been a lot better. Despite this supposedly being the story of how Big Boss's character changes from hero to villain, there's surprisingly little character here to develop. Venom just goes through scene after scene, barely talking, barely reacting. He just stands around while other people talk, and then he goes to save the world like some kind of generic action hero. He doesn't seem to have opinions or thoughts on anything. How do you develop a character when there's barely even a character there? Though, that's not to say that everyone's silent. Most of the dialogue this time around has been moved to cassette tapes. And this is what most people will say in response to criticism that the game lacked dialogue. Now, in concept, cassette tapes should basically serve as a replacement to codec calls, and everything should be fine. We should still have the same amount of character interaction, right? Unfortunately, the majority of these cassettes are basically just Kaz or Ocelot talking at Big Boss more than they're talking with him. Basically, it's all exposition, not interaction. You'll get info about the game's politics, its organizations, and the world in general, but save for a few tapes about character backgrounds, these don't really develop the characters, or their relationships. Quiet's bound to spark some debate. There's an inherent problem with trying to develop a character who can't speak, especially when so much of the game's story has been pushed into cassette tapes. Sometimes she feels like she's just there for fan service, and to be honest, for a lot of the game, she is. But that's not all she's there for. Quiet is the only character that seems to spark some kind of reaction and emotion from Venom, and he does the same for Quiet. This is probably why I thought a few of the scenes with Quiet managed to be some of the best. Here we have two characters, one who doesn't talk and one who barely talks, who seem to be forming some kind of relationship, even if we don't know what kind it is. Big Boss manages to show some emotion, and Quiet does too. Somehow, it did a surprisingly good job of endearing both of them to me. These scenes are probably where a lot of my investment in the game's story came from, and where I started to care about these characters. It doesn't necessarily make them good or well-developed characters, but at least makes them more likable. It's one of the few instances where the less talkative direction has some payoff. Unfortunately, there's just not enough of it, and it's mostly just between these two characters. And the character development isn't helped by the game's awkward story structure. It starts off strong, progressing at a good pace for the first 3 to 4 hours before it starts to slow down. There are a ton of main missions here, but what constitutes a main mission in this game is kind of strange. You will usually end up getting 2 to 3 filler missions before you get one that actually advances the plot. And even then, it probably doesn't do much with the characters. Sometimes these characters won't have any meaningful impact for massive stretches of the game. Between Quiet becoming available as a buddy and the end of Chapter 1, she barely does anything in the plot. There were a few standout missions that seemed to up the ante, but they'd always end up returning to the same slow pace. Around Mission 26, the game starts to ramp up, and it carries it through to the end of Chapter 1. And then Chapter 2 begins. Of the next 19 main missions in Chapter 2, 12 of them are Chapter 1 missions, rehashed with a new mode of difficulty. They offer no new story content and only slightly change the gameplay. This is just strange. Chapter 1 felt like it was stuffed with filler, like they made more game content than they did story content. But Chapter 2 feels like they ran out of game content, but put whatever filler they could find in anyway. I'm guessing Kojima meant for Chapter 2 to have more unique content, but budget restraints didn't allow it, and they had already made all the Chapter 1 content. There's so much wrong with this. Chapter 2 contains some of the most dramatic scenes in the entire game, but locking this stuff behind content that we've already done takes so much wind out of the game's sails. Some of these difficulty modes are really cool, but they should have been optional modes for all missions, not mandatory content breaking up the story. That way the people only interested in the story wouldn't have to dredge through difficult missions they have no interest in doing again, and people who are open to the challenge would be able to take them on as they pleased, on any mission. The current system is bad for the gameplay people and the story people. I'm about to go into more detail about the characters, which means I'll pretty much be spoiling the entire game. This is your warning. Skullface is quite possibly the biggest letdown character-wise. He was built up to be a pretty big villain for the franchise. The trailers implied that he would be complicit in Big Boss becoming the villain. That, for whatever reason, Big Boss would have to make a deal with Skullface, and this would be either the cause or the result of Big Boss becoming a demon. Basically, the trailers made it seem like he'd play a much greater role in not just the plot, but the development of other characters. Sure, he's responsible for the conflict in Phantom Pain, but he never ends up being more than just another generic villain pining for global domination. For the most part, he plays Puppet Master just to push the story along. He only has a few scenes, once or twice he even manages to talk to Venom, and then after one long monologue as you stare at him in the back of a jeep, he dies. Big Boss never has to make any reluctant agreements with him, and he certainly isn't responsible for Big Boss becoming a villain. Especially considering that never even happens. Venom is about as heroic at the end of this game as he was at the beginning, maybe even more so. I thought Venom being forced to kill members of Outer Heaven might have had some kind of effect on him, that this might unhinge him and set him down his dark path, even if he did it to save lives. But the game ends shortly thereafter, so there's no hint that this damages him in any way. The only character that even tries to tell you that what you did was wrong was Huey, and a few missions after that it's revealed that he murdered Strangelove and used Otacon for experiments with Sahelanthropus. I can't really say I value his moral compass. The only argument for Venom's character development you could really make is that as the game progresses, the relationship between him and Quiet grows. But there's far from a focus on this relationship, and Big Boss responds to the loss of Quiet almost as stoically as he responds to every single other thing in this game. It's a far cry from the emotional impact we saw in MGS3. What was the point of this whole story if it doesn't actually develop Big Boss and show how he changes from the Naked Snake we know in MGS3 to the Big Boss we know in later chronology? It feels like a damn side story. Granted, I think I could have been alright with that if it were a better side story, if it did more with its characters. And as for Quiet, the actions leading up to her death feel incredibly contrived. At any point, she could have taken the Wolbachia and been cured of the vocal parasites. The explanation for her not doing this is that she still wasn't sure if she wanted to take revenge on Venom or not. But that's bullshit. She makes a fairly strong resolution at the end of her torture scene never to speak for fear of hurting Venom and those around her. Later, it's heavily implied by Quiet herself that she was in love with Venom. Her very statements indicate that she had decided not to take revenge on him, so here we have two fairly contradictory statements, both given by the game itself. This is an absolutely contrived way to force a character's death. I get that this might have been trying to tie into the whole Phantom Pain thing, but if you're going to kill a character, it shouldn't come from contrivance. I'm sorry, but this is just poor writing. Oh, and the whole thing where you have to delete your save file if you want to get Quiet back as a buddy. If you wanted to piss people off, this is one way to do it. Honestly, Quiet being such a prominent gameplay element should have been a red flag to begin with in a game like this. Either you limit what you do with your story so that it doesn't mess up the gameplay, or you risk messing up the gameplay so you don't have to hold back your story. Either way, Kojima backed himself into a corner here. I don't really have any problems with Kaz or Ocelot, save for the same development and interaction issues I have with everyone else. As supporting characters, these two do their jobs. Ocelot is charming, and Kaz's thirst for revenge makes him relatable. Kaz can be abrasive, mistrusting, and generally difficult to like, when he's telling you to kill Quiet, for example. But I think most players will end up liking him regardless, simply because it's easy to understand where he's coming from.
Diamond Dogs.
Huey's one of the more interesting characters. You may start out feeling sorry for him, but as the game goes on, it gets harder to believe anything that he says until you realize he's probably the most vile person in this entire game, even if he can't face it himself. The biggest issue I have with Huey is that he doesn't really affect the story much. Pretty much everything he actually does, he does before the game even begins. Building Sahelanthropus, killing Strangelove, assisting in the original attack on Mother Base. For the rest of the game, he's basically used as a writing crutch. He's there so that whenever Kojima needs to reveal something about the plot, Ocelot can just go in and interrogate him again. Still, I appreciated Huey's inclusion in the story and the way he was handled. All of his plot is advanced through character drama, not exposition about shady military organizations and political parties filled to overflow with jargon. Just characters. As for the game's shocking twist ending, I'm not sure I'll ever have a firm opinion on this. It feels a lot like a Shyamalan twist, and it kind of invalidates what this story was supposed to be about. And that leaves a pretty sour taste in my mouth. The whole meta point Kojima was making about you being Big Boss as you've played these games and experienced these moments alongside him was decent, but I'm not sure it was worth losing out on developing the real Big Boss. I think I would have appreciated this a lot more if it were coming from a new IP, or if this weren't the end to the entire Metal Gear series. This game was marketed to be the story of Big Boss becoming a villain, so you'd think that would be how it would end. But the rest of the story never facilitates this. Venom is never put into a situation that forces him to become a villain. Maybe killing his own men could have affected him, but it certainly isn't shown in game. He's obviously not happy about it, but there's no indication that it somehow made him evil. And even if it did, that's Venom, not Big Boss. In order for this game to fulfill pre-release promises, the entire story would have to be changed. Skullface would need to be a more prominent character, forcing Big Boss to reluctantly make hard decisions that affected his character until he eventually became the demon we were led to believe he'd become. Character interaction would need a greater focus in order to properly elevate the stakes. Big Boss becoming a villain would make a hell of a lot more sense if he did it because of characters that he visibly cared about. But from the ground up, Phantom Pain's story was not written like this. Skullface is just another throwaway villain designed to push along the plot. Save for a few scenes with Quiet, Big Boss showed all the emotion and character of a cardboard cutout. The other characters weren't terrible, but when there's so little drama driving anyone in this game, it's hard to say they were good either. Kojima promised us one story, and gave us another. Which, honestly, I think I could have been okay with if the story we got was better. Don't get me wrong, I like these characters, but they weren't well written, they weren't well developed, and God knows they weren't well portrayed. The actors are good, but Kojima didn't know what to do with them if he couldn't make them talk all the time. Venom is barely even a character for all the emotion he shows. Kojima decided to make one of his characters mute, and one practically mute. This isn't a bad thing in and of itself. I think a good director should be able to make relatable, likable, and even well-developed characters with sparse or no dialogue. But Kojima isn't a good enough director. For years he's been using truckloads of dialogue as a crutch for making his characters and his games more enjoyable. And it's worked for a long time. Now he's decided to forgo this crutch, which is admirable, but sadly he's fallen down without it. Now, I realize this isn't going to be a popular opinion, especially considering it includes the phrase, Kojima isn't a good enough director, especially with the fuck Konami bandwagon hailing Kojima as a flawless god. I mean, fuck Konami, but Kojima's still just a person. But I encourage everyone to really look at how these characters are handled and how much, over a 50-hour-long game, they actually change and develop, as well as how much is done to make them seem convincingly like real people. Granted, Venom not talking was likely a decision made to make it easier for the player to place themselves in his shoes, which makes sense given the ending. This line of thinking could negate a lot of my criticisms towards Venom, but I've never been a fan of the silent, or near silent as the case may be, protagonist. I think the best way to place your audience in the shoes of a character is to make them a relatable character, not devoid of character. And it's absolutely no excuse for the rest of the cast lacking development and meaningful interaction. I don't want to make it seem like I absolutely hated this game's story, because I didn't. If I did, I wouldn't have cared enough to say all of this about it. I like these characters and I like this game. I don't want to understate that. This may be my favorite game of 2015. But I'm still disappointed with what Kojima's done with these characters and this story. It's possible that I would have liked it more if the trailers hadn't promised a different story than what we got, but I think I'd still have problems with the way characters are handled. At the end of the day, a story will always be about its characters. And this is where I feel Metal Gear Solid 5 is at its worst. Kojima's created a fantastic gameplay experience that I may be coming back to for years. But every time I do, I'll remember the disappointment I felt with the story, and that's a slightly sour way to end this series. I don't know how you made it this far, but you did it. Thanks for watching.
Mission complete, boss.
Oh, and there's some rumors going around that on September 11th, Kojima will update the game and unlock additional story content. If by some miracle this happens, then, well, Kojima's a crazy person, first of all. Second, it may invalidate a lot of my criticisms. But I made this on the 10th, so it still counts, okay? Okay?